The last time that I watched the original 1984 The Karate Kid was in 2019. And at the time, I did know about Cobra Kai, although I had not watched it yet. But I was always a fan of The Karate Kid going back to my childhood. I remember seeing the movie on TV a few times and never all the way through. I always saw bits and pieces of it and kind of put it together way back when, until the era of DVD, when I was able to get the movie on DVD and see it start to finish without having to put pieces together. But now that I've gone through Cobra Kai season 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the first part of 6, I thought I would go back and revisit the original classic, the one that started it all, the 1984 Karate Kid, directed by John G. Avildsen, who also did 2 and 3, as well as the Rocky movies, well, Rocky 1 and Rocky 5, and written by the original creator of all these characters, Robert Mark Kamen, who I believe was consulting on Cobra Kai, because I've seen interviews where he's discussed talking to the big three from Cobra Kai about where they took the characters. So I decided to go back and watch the movie to see how I felt about it now. The Karate Kid was a very, very huge movie for me as a kid. Kids of the 80s and early 90s really, really remember the Karate Kid as being like the younger Rocky. And in many ways, the movie follows the same story beats as Rocky. Very young Ralph Macchio stars in the movie alongside, of course, William Zabka, who was only in a few scenes of the movie, along with Elizabeth Shue, Pat Morita, and of course Martin Kove as the evil John Kreese, the master, the instructor, the sensei of Cobra Kai. Now look, there's plenty of great reviews on this film and breakdowns all over YouTube where you can see interviews, there's documentaries on here with the actors and the writer. There's great, deconstructions of the film. I'm going to give you my thoughts on seeing it now, 40 years later, and if it still holds up. One of the things that I noticed watching it back this time is that a lot of the movie, you really don't see much of the Miyagi training until maybe around the halfway point. And I feel like, in some ways, that's not how I had remembered it. Because for some reason, I remembered the training starting in the first act. And that is not the case at all. All the first act does is establish that Daniel's in a new city with his mom. He meets Allie, runs into, of course, Johnny, and that begins the feud. John G. Avildsen spends a lot of time getting us accustomed to the character of Daniel and kind of learning more about him. He's just a regular kid who really doesn't want to be in LA but has to deal with bullies. However, the way that Cobra Kai sort of took the events of this movie and gave us the Johnny Lawrence version, I thought was brilliant, because watching it back now with those eyes, I can understand why Johnny was pissed off at Daniel. Now, I'm not saying that makes him the good guy. Ultimately, when the movie ends and Daniel wins, he does give him the trophy, even though later on he says it was an illegal kick in Cobra Kai. Still, that does happen. And looking back on it, Daniel is still the good guy. Without question, he's the protagonist. But I definitely do see things from Johnny's point of view. What people don't remember, at least I certainly didn't, is that Johnny only has about 4 or 5 scenes in this whole movie. The big part of this movie is establishing the relationship between Daniel and Mr. Miyagi. Now, the thing is, that's the heart of this film. That relationship, that sort of father-son dynamic. And one of the things that I loved about what Cobra Kai did is, and it's been somewhat criticized, but it makes sense. Mr. Miyagi, in this movie, Daniel tells him, "You're the best friend I ever had," which is a very, very touching moment. Very touching moment. And you really do see that, because Miyagi does act like a friend and like a father figure to a kid who he barely even knew. And he had empathy for him because, bullies are not cool. He was getting jumped. It wasn't just Johnny beating him up. He was getting jumped by Johnny and his friends. And so learning self-defense is important. But what really stole the movie for me, and it's the same thing that stole the movie for everybody back in the day, is Pat Morita's performance as Mr. Miyagi. When you watch this movie as a kid, when I watched it when I was a kid on TV in different parts, Daniel was the character I cared more about because I could relate to him. I was a victim of bullying. I didn't study martial arts to the degree that he did, but my brother was a black belt, so I understood a lot of it. And I understood his trials and tribulations dealing with bullies and sort of coming into his own. When it comes to Mr. Miyagi, I always liked Mr. Miyagi. I mean, this movie's iconic. Wax on, wax off, and all that stuff. You know, paint the fence. It's all pretty legendary at this point. But Pat Morita, I don't know if y'all know this, but if you watch a Pat Morita interview, that Japanese Okinawa accent, that's not how he really talks. Pat Morita was of Asian descent legitimately, but he didn't have that accent. And yes, I was way too young to see Happy Days. I know it was on reruns. I never got into Happy Days. I never got to see it. So I couldn't really give you a frame of reference from Happy Days. What I could do is tell you about his performance here, and it really is incredible. He comes off like this lovable old man who it shows vulnerability. He's not perfect, especially the scenes where he talks about his wife and kid and what happened to them. And I wonder if that's going to play a role in Cobra Kai, the last few episodes, if we're going to revisit that story again. But he's a man who is dangerous with his hands. We see him break apart the beer bottles. We see him just smash 5 kids at once who are way younger than he is and with more energy. Of course, he's the more skilled martial artist. But man, what an incredible performance. Like now I really understand being an older guy and looking at sort of more objectively films. He really is the heart and soul of this movie. But the music of this movie, Bill Conti, it gave me chills. So what I did was I watched The Karate Kid, and then I went back and I rewatched the entire first season of Cobra Kai. And that scene in episode 5 or episode 4, I think it was 4 or 5, where Daniel ends the episode putting on the bandana and doing the katas, and you hear the Bill Conti Karate Kid theme with the whistles, and I had goosebumps, bro. It was like my whole body was shaking. That's the magic of music. That's the power of music, especially in cinema. You remember these musical cues, these great anthems. And I like how there are obviously going to be a ton of similarities to Rocky. Same composer, same director, similar vibe, both Italian-American characters, main characters. But, man, that music is so legendary. Because he didn't try to replicate the Rocky formula with the horns, and it wasn't that, even though there was a lot of great action themes in the soundtrack. Great, amazing soundtrack. But the, I guess, blending of East meets West. Western contemporary orchestral music with Eastern flutes and things like that. It's phenomenal because it perfectly captures the relationship between Miyagi, a Japanese American, and Daniel, an Italian American. Of all the Karate Kid movies and even Cobra Kai, this is the most realistic. Pat Johnson, who plays the referee, he was also, if you remember, he was also in Enter the Dragon. He was legitimately trained by Bruce Lee. He's the main choreographer, and if you look into the behind the scenes, William Zabka says that he was trained by Pat Johnson like Cobra Kai would train him, more like a drill sergeant style, more aggressive. And then he trained Ralph Macchio in a more Miyagi style. So Pat Johnson knew the offense and defense. I mean, he had complete mastery of offense and defensive martial arts, and he taught each actor differently so that when they got together to shoot their choreographed scenes, that the style and the aggressiveness of both, Daniel and Johnny matched up with the Cobra Kai and the Miyagi-Do style. And that, to me, is fantastic. Like, finding out this kind of stuff is fascinating because, I don't know if you know, but William Zabka legit got into martial arts after this movie came out. He got into it for a few years because of, I guess, playing the character and also Pat Johnson's training. That's a cool story. And it's interesting when you look at Robert Mark Kamen's past because he based a lot of this movie on real life stuff. He did study martial arts. He did get beat up by bullies. And you can tell because the movie does have a sense of realism. That was one thing that the Karate Kid and season 1 of Cobra Kai really match up with. Season 2, with that crazy, rumble at the end that would never happen in real life quite like that. Yeah, and then of course the Karate Kid Part 2 where a kid who's a high schooler is in a battle to the death. Little bit far-fetched. However, you could say the same thing about some of the Rocky movies, really blending fiction with reality. Either way, this movie feels very grounded, and I think it is because so much of it was based on real events with characters change and situations change for dramatic purposes. The film is a bit slower than I remembered. Of course, I mentioned that I saw it in 2019 start to finish. I've seen it a few times in my life. It was not like I've only seen it twice. But I think a lot of the nostalgia in my own brain kind of made me think the movie was only about 90 minutes when really it was about 2 hours. Like 2 hours and a few minutes. It's not a long movie, but it's not that short. And I had just forgotten so much stuff. Like I even forgot the scene where Daniel, Johnny, and Lawrence are at that like ball. Like I totally forgot about that scene. I totally, for some reason in my head, maybe because like I said, my original viewings of it were sort of clustered out. That could be why that happened. But it's not slow in a bad way. It does a great job of building up the characters and getting us to care. And it is a lot like the first Rocky movie. Definitely like the first one. Also, the music, I mentioned Bill Conti, but also the songs still hold up. You're the Best Around from Joe Esposito is a classic. I cannot wait for them to play it in Cobra Kai. I know they're going to do it in Part 6. I know they are in Part 3 of Season 6. Maybe even Part 2. And Survivor, The Moment of Truth. Really, really good song. Underrated. Stallone picked Eye of the Tiger for Rocky 3, which I understand. That is a legendary song too. But man, Moment of Truth. Watching it this time really hit me. I mean, hard. It hit me hard. The Karate Kid still holds up. And if you or you know somebody who has seen Cobra Kai but not the movie, you need to see the movie. I'm going to be reviewing all 3 of the movies here on World of Geekdom. Maybe even the next Karate Kid. In fact, I might even do that one and the 2010, which I haven't even seen that one yet, and give my thoughts on it because there's a new Karate Kid coming out next year, so we might as well have them all wrapped up. Anyways, those are my thoughts on watching the Karate Kid again, revisiting it after seeing Cobra Kai, and seeing if anything changed, and I still like it, and I really appreciate the movie a lot more now, especially Miyagi and Pat Morita's performance, but they're all pretty great. With that being said, catch you next time.